Hello and welcome back to the Convict Diaries. I'm Denise. We're going to journey back to colonial times again and explore life in the colonies. Today we will look at the bushranger and our man, Michael Howe, who after his death was referred to as the last and the worst of the bushrangers of Van Diemen's Land. You can be the judge. Setting the scene. Van Diemen's Land. It's the southeastern Australian island. It was first encountered by Europeans in 1642. It was named by Abel J. Tasman, a celebrated navigator, for Anthony Van Diemen, and originally called Terra de Diemans. Van Diemen was the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. In January 1777, on his third voyage, Cook, on board the Resolution, charted the southeast coast of the island and interacted with the Aboriginal inhabitants. It was not until the joint voyage of Matthew Flinders and George Bass, who circumnavigated Tasmania in 1798 to 1799, that it was recognised that this region of Australia was actually an island. The colonisation of Australia, which had begun in 1788, was in full swing by the outset of the 19th century. Van Diemen's Land was established as a colony in 1803, when a fleet led by Lieutenant John Bowen was sent from Sydney to deter the French from claiming the island. Initially they set up camp at Ryston in 1803, but when Lieutenant Colonel David Collins joined Bowen in 1804, he identified that the location was unsuitable, so there was a successful move to Hobart Town. The settlement started out as part of the colony of New South Wales, but the colonists were anxious to separate and petitioned the King to use his power under Section 44 of the New South Wales Act 1823 and grant their independence from New South Wales. Van Diemen's Land became a separate colony in 1825. From 1803, there was immediate and severe problems confronting the free settlers and the convicts from the very beginning. They needed to find ways to survive, as very few ships were visiting. For 18 months, absolutely everyone from Collins down was without basic supplies. By 1806, the colony was starving. Clearing land was essential, yet this was put in the too hard basket in favour of securing the one abundant food source on the island, kangaroos. Even the convicts were sent out armed to hunt. Lawlessness ran riot throughout the colony. The unprecedented slaughter of the kangaroos had a really dramatic effect on the local Aborigines, whose traditional hunting grounds had been abruptly seized and their cultural and essential food source was declining. The struggle for land rights had begun. The colonists were violent and aggressive in their efforts to control the island, and this resulted in long, drawn-out conflicts, pitting the settlers and the British military against the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, and it nearly led to the extermination of the locals. Many of the convicts soon realised that, once armed, they could survive very well outside the protection of the settlement, and they absconded. These escaped prisoners joined with others, and bands of bushrangers were formed. They would terrorise outlying farms and travellers. Michael Howe. By 1813, rebels and rogues were becoming more and more prevalent, and bushranging blossomed on the island. Michael Howe was one of these rogues, and he stands out against the others. His story has been so twisted and contorted over the 200 years since he roamed through the bush that it often makes him look like the most ruthless, dangerous and bloodthirsty of all the bushrangers. And this is despite the fact that historical records seemingly back up the idea that Howe was something of a gentleman bushranger. The folklore, myths and the spreading of half-truths and lies has had a long-lasting and negative impact on our understanding of Howe and his story. It is apparent that Howe was driven by hatred of the harsh British laws and their often ruthless enforcers. Out of desperation and the need to survive, Howe resorted to bushranging. While he was an outlaw, it would seem that wherever possible he avoided bloodshed. When dealing with anyone he disliked, he could be wicked. The opposite applied when dealing with those he did not dislike, in which case he could be kind and pleasant. Howe's life before bushranging. Howe was born in 1787 in Pontefract, Yorkshire, the son of Thomas Howe and his wife Elizabeth. Life during this time was rough on lower class families thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Poverty was rampant. For a young man in these impoverished times, there were only two options: join the armed forces or live a life of crime. Initially, Howe chose to serve Queen and country, briefly enlisting in the army before joining the Royal Navy on a man-of-war, then later on a merchant naval vessel. However, unhappy with the harsh treatment inflicted on him as a sailor and a soldier, he fled the Navy by jumping overboard. He needed to try his hand at something else. Now he was on the run because of his absconding and was looking for a means of supporting himself. So Howe could see crime as his only option, and he became a highwayman. Howe was caught, tried and convicted at York Assizes on the 31st of July 1811 for robbing a miller on the King's Highway. His sentence, transportation for 7 years. Howe travelled to New South Wales on board the Minstrel, and he was then transferred to the Indefatigable and taken to Van Diemen's Land. He arrived in Van Diemen's Land in October 1812. One of Howe's shipmates was a young man named James Whitehead, who would become a noteworthy part of Howe's life. So now we'll take a little detour to look at James Whitehead. Like Michael, James was from Yorkshire. He hailed from Preston in the East Riding of Yorkshire. He was described as being a good-looking young man. His character was humane and good. He was attributed with these qualities throughout his bushranging career. There is no record of him wantonly killing a man or destroying property, and it would seem that he acted with a strong moral compass. There are many examples of this in historical records. For instance, he chose to leave the company of George Watts and Thomas Garland in March 1815 due to their acts of wanton destruction. He was also happy to give Mrs. Triffitt back her dress material after she had requested it, even tipping his hat to her in apology for the action. Finally, his words to George Green, servant to Magistrate Humphrey, speaks volumes in how he viewed outlaw life, which is a far cry from the brutal, power-crazed man we see on film. After George expressed his regret at seeing James in such a situation, James suddenly looked downcast and replied he was sorry to find himself in that situation also, adding it never would have been the case if not for the treatment he had received at the hands of his previous master. Just as a point of interest, there were several John Whiteheads operating around the same time as James, as records prove that one died in March 1815, as recorded by Robert Knotwood in his diary, and the second in September 1815, with the latter committing most of the barbarities unjustly attributed to James. So back to Michael. As part of his sentence, Howe was assigned to the wealthy merchant and grazier John Ingle, who had a reputation as a harsh and overbearing boss. Howe seemingly resented indentured servitude and is believed to have clashed many times with Ingle, and one last time before he took to the bush. No doubt the treatment of convicts was a driving factor in Howe's rebellion. He joined up with the gang of other bolters led by Peter Mills. Mills was the former acting deputy surveyor of lands at Port Dalrymple, and George Williams, former acting deputy commissary of stores and provisions. Peter Mills had run up debts and he had taken to the bush. The gang took up raiding farms and camps for supplies, even stealing herds of sheep and cattle for their own purposes, with most of the men being rather quiet and level-headed. There were a few that tended to be outspoken and volatile. On May 14, 1814, Lieutenant Governor Mccarty issued a proclamation. He gave the gang members until the 1st of December to return to their assignments. A pardon for all crimes committed during the absence would be the reward for handing themselves in before this date. Despite what myth says, Howe did not turn himself in. On the night of the 18th of August 1814, Howe, John Mills, James Geary, Edward Begent and Thomas Burrell bailed up a party of soldiers who were escorting 2 bushrangers who they had captured near Epping Forest and 3 Crown prisoners from the port to Hobart Town. Corporal Fentrell, his son Private Fentrell, and Private Mary were sleeping. The gang held muskets to their heads. "Lay still, you buggers," Howe warned, "or we will blow you to pieces." Interestingly, it appears that they had left the port with 5 bushrangers, but the other men had managed to escape into the bush before their meeting with Howe. On the 22nd of August, word of this incident had reached Lieutenant Governor Davy. Reverend Robert Knotwood recorded the following in his diary. The Lieutenant Governor received dispatches from Port Dalrymple. The party was stopped by the bushrangers and their arms taken from them. At this time, James Whitehead was a member of an ever-growing gang roaming the bush, and Howe joined him. Other confirmed members of this gang were Richard Maguire, Hugh Byrne, Richard Collier, Peter Septon, George Bumpy Jones, James Geary, and 2 Aboriginal women. While I unfortunately cannot find the name of one, the other was named to Mary Cockrell, also known as Black Mary. The gang was surviving by raiding farms in and around New Norfolk. It was their usual way that only a small number of the group would head out to get to work at targeted farms, while the bulk of them would stay at the camp. Howe and the gang were probably being used in some way or another, as most of the attacks seemed to be based on information supplied to them by those that were harbouring them. This included the prominent figure Edward Lord. Lord was known at the time to be the richest man in Van Diemen's Land. It would seem as though the bushrangers were being used to cause grief to particular farmers in the region that were in conflict with those colonists that sheltered them. This was probably part of an ongoing, unofficial land war between the wealthy settlers. The ex-convict Dennis Mccarty, the owner of Birchgrove Farm, had frequent run-ins with the bushranger. Apparently one time he had spotted some of the gang on the outskirts of his property making moccasins, and he opened fire. In haste, the gang bolted for cover, and a battle ensued. Apparently, one of Mccarty's servants launched into an attack against the bushrangers with a cutlass. Howe saw a member of the gang named James Geary making a move to kill him. Howe intervened and stopped the murder. During the fight, unfortunately, most of Mccarty's men were injured, but Mccarty made his escape. The bushrangers took all the spoils they could carry and left. As a result of injuries sustained during this fight, Charles Carlyle died, and the charge of his murder was laid upon James Whitehead, Peter Septon, Michael Howe, Richard Collier, Hugh Byrne, James Geary, and Mary Cockerell. Over the course of time, Maguire and Byrne were tried and executed for the murder of Carlyle. Such blatant impudence was not acceptable, and on the 25th of April 1815, Lieutenant Governor Davy controversially declared martial law in an effort to come down firmly on the elusive outlaws. Unfortunately, it did not produce the desired effect, and on the 10th of May the gang raided the house of Dolores Humphrey. The family was not home when the bushrangers reached their home. The gang went to work pillaging the house. Howe, Geary and Maguire found leg irons in the house, which was a clear sign to them that Humphrey had been mistreating his servants. In a response, they rampaged through the place and smashed or wrecked everything they could. Seeking a revenge on Dennis Mccarty, on the 18th of May they attacked his property. Unfortunately, the attack had been anticipated, and there was a party of soldiers from Hobart stationed inside the homestead, and the Mccarty family were nowhere to be seen. James Whitehead was scouting the perimeter of the homestead when a soldier fired at him. He died from his injuries. There was a firefight, and during the chaos, Whitehead's body was decapitated, supposedly so that no soldier could make claim for the reward on his head. There are many versions of this story. One claims that Whitehead ordered Howe to take his watch, which was a code for the decapitation, a request that Howe complied with, and then flaunted it like a trophy at the soldiers before escaping. Suffices to say that someone removed his head, and the headless corpse was dumped on the doorstep to be found by Mccarty when he arrived home. The head was later found discarded in the bush, and the rest of the remains were hung up in chains on Hunter Island in Hobart. Howe would soon step up into more of a leadership role. He was a composed and calm man and had an authoritative presence. This would help to keep the wilder inclinations of his mates under control. He took much pride in the position, often referring to himself as the governor of the Rangers, as opposed to the governor of the town, who was the official head of government. The gang's numbers began to dwindle. Hugh Byrne and Richard Maguire were apprehended in a hut after a shootout with soldiers of the 46th Regiment and were hanged. In September 1815, the remaining gang undertook an incursion on the farm of Richard Fry at Elphin near Port Dalrymple. At this time, it was reported that the gang now consisted of only about half a dozen members. On July the 5th, 1816, Howe, Septon, Collier, Geary, and George Jones bailed up Thomas Seals in his shack. They baked damper, shot, butchered, and ate one of his cows, leaving the scraps for the dogs. They stayed at the shack for several days, and upon leaving took Thomas Seals with them. They committed several robberies before letting Seals go that evening. On the 8th of September 1816, the gang attacked the property of Lieutenant Governor Davy. Howe fixed himself some eggnog during this daring robbery, while Peter Septon gave a sick man a drink of wine and milk, a popular remedy for illness at this time. Before leaving, Howe borrowed a dictionary and swore he would return it. On the 8th of February 1817, Peter Septon, George Jones, John Brown, Mary Cockerell, and another unnamed Aboriginal woman were travelling close to Launceston. During this trip, they came upon a man and two women. Fearful that their whereabouts may become known to the soldiers, the bushrangers took them to a farmhouse owned by James Cox. A report in the Hobart Town Gazette at the time stated that the outlaws behaved in the most becoming manner, having refused to take any refreshments till the ladies had done, and even led their horses the next day over the difficult part of the New River. The gang repeatedly targeted the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Davey, and on more than one occasion members of the gang broke into the homestead and took items that they believed they needed at the time. Members of Howe's gang at this time included Peter Septon, Richard Collier, James Geary, George Jones, Matthew Keegan, John Brown, John Parker, John Chapman, Thomas Coyne, Thomas Craig, and the two native women. The gang easily evaded the soldiers that were sent after them, until in April 1817, when Howe and Mary Cockerell were ambushed by some soldiers from the 46th Regiment. Howe scurried away, firing back at the redcoats before dumping his gear, including his knapsack and firearm. The story that is typically quoted here is that during this chase, Howe shot Mary, either unintentionally or intentionally, as she was slowing him down. However, it really isn't clear from records of the day if she was indeed shot at all. Also, allegations that Mary was pregnant with Howe's child are more than likely false. The soldiers retrieved Howe's effects, which included a musket and a gardening book bound in kangaroo skin, filled with handwritten notes. Immediately after her capture, Mary began to help the police track down the rest of the gang. She took them to their camp by the Shannon River. When the soldiers approached the bushrangers, the outlaws ridiculed them and scuttled off into the bush. Mary facilitated the recovery of some stolen sheep and was rewarded for her help with clothes, food and accommodation. The new Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, William Sorrell, was settling in. In an effort to bring an end to the anarchy and lawlessness, Sorrell issued a proclamation promising severe consequences for outlaws and those that harboured them. He also offered an amnesty. Tired of the outlaw lifestyle, Howe saw this as an opportunity to give it up forever, and intending to negotiate a surrender, began writing to Sorrell. Howe managed the negotiations very carefully. He agreed that he would give the authorities the information they wanted, but in return he wanted to be given a royal pardon. Howe was taken into custody in Hobart on the 29th of April 1817 to await sanction of the pardon. While he was in captivity, he mostly occupied himself with peddling items he had been knitting while awaiting news of his pardon. Whilst in custody, Howe made the claim that the esteemed magistrate, Robert Knopwood, was one of the associates of the gang. He claimed that Knopwood had even personally escorted himself and fellow gang member George Watts through the streets of Hobart. Whilst Howe was in custody, a new member of the gang named George Hillier murdered one of Howe's friends, Peter Septon, and attempted to murder Richard Collier. Collier was subsequently hanged in Hobart. It was also during this time that several other members of the gang had been captured or killed by soldiers like George Jones, who was shot and decapitated by soldiers. It is commonly believed that Howe received information from an associate named Beecroft that his pardon had been refused, and that in response Howe took advantage of the relaxed security he had as a result of his negotiations and fled to the bush once more. However, this report was probably not true. In fact, the pardon had been approved. Howe now found himself alone and on the run. He reconnected with a fellow ex-gang member, George Watts, hoping to get supplies and information. But Watts was conspiring with a stockman named William Drew to capture Howe and claim the reward. They pounced on Howe while he was in camp and restrained him. Somehow Howe managed to break free of his bonds and attempted to take Watts' musket. Revealing a hidden dagger, he stabbed Watts, then used the musket to shoot Drew. George Watts was not dead, and he managed to make his way back to town. Before dying of his wounds, Watts was able to pass on an account of the encounter. Howe found himself unable to trust anyone and was living a very solitary life in a hut by the Shannon River. He had no ammunition. He was unable to find anything of great value to eat, and his clothes were like rags on his back. His days were spent in terror of being found by local Aboriginals, as there was a group of them active in the area, launching attacks on settlers. At this time, at least one murder that was pinned on Howe was more than likely committed by this band of Aboriginals. He was being chased by bounty hunters and was actually ambushed by one, a tracker by the name of Mccarty, a man who would later earn a reputation as a bushranger. During this struggle, Howe once again lost his supplies, including a journal made from kangaroo skin. He had written about his most intimate thoughts and ominous dreams. Howe was fearful, desperate, and vulnerable. He was forced to clothe himself in a cloak of stitched together kangaroo skins, and he wore a long and bushy dark beard. He was afraid to sleep for fear of death or capture. However, he received word from an associate, a kangaroo hunter named Warburton, that there were supplies for him. To Howe, this offer was irresistible. Howe's death. Warburton had struck a deal with a farmer named Worrell to lure Howe and kill him for the reward of £200 and free passage back to England. Warburton managed to lure Howe to his home on the River Shannon, where Worrell and an infantryman named Pugh were concealed, ready with their firearms. The 21st of October 1818. This is a recount of Howe's capture as written in a military sketchbook. I was now, says Worrell, determined to make a push for the capture of this villain, Mick Howe, for which I was promised a passage to England on the next ship that sailed, and the amount of reward laid upon his head. I found out a man of the name of Warburton, who was in the habit of hunting kangaroos for their skins, and who had frequently met Howe during his excursions, and sometimes furnished him with ammunition. He gave me such an account of Howe's habits that I felt convinced we could take him with a little assistance. I therefore spoke to a man named Hugh, belonging to the 48th Regiment, one who I knew was a most cool and resolute fellow. He immediately entered into my views, and having applied to Major Bell, his commanding officer, he was recommended by him to the governor, by whom he was permitted to act and allowed to join us. So he and I went directly to Warburton. who heartily entered into the scheme, and all things were arranged for putting it into execution. The plan was this. Pugh and I were to remain at Warburton's house, while Warburton himself was to fall into Howe's way. The hut was on the River Shannon, standing so completely by itself and so out of the track of anybody who might be feared by Howe, that there was every possibility of accomplishing our wishes, and scotch the snake, as they say, if not kill it. Pugh and I accordingly proceeded to the appointed hut. We arrived there before daybreak, and having made a hearty breakfast, Warburton set out to seek Howe. He took no arms with him in order to still more effectually carry his point, but Pugh and I were provided with muskets and pistols. The sun had just been an hour up when we saw Warburton and Howe upon the top of the hill coming towards the hut. We expected that they would be with us in a quarter of an hour, and so we sat down upon the trunk of a tree inside the hut, calmly waiting for their arrival. An hour passed, but they did not come, and I crept to the door cautiously and peeped out. There I saw them standing within 100 yards of us in earnest conversation. As I learned afterwards, the delay arose from Howe suspecting that all was not right. I drew back from the door to my station, and about 10 minutes after this we plainly heard footsteps and the voice of Warburton. Another moment, and Howe slowly entered the hut, his gun presented and cocked. The instant he espied us, he cried out, "Is that your game?" and immediately fired. But Pugh's activity prevented the shot from taking effect, for he knocked the gun aside. Howe ran off like a wolf. I fired, but missed. Pugh then halted and took aim at him, but also missed. I immediately flung away the gun and ran after Howe, Pugh in pursuit. Warburton was a considerable distance away. I ran very fast, so did Howe, and if he had not fallen down an unexpected bank, I should not have been fleet enough for him. This fall, however, brought me up with him. He was on his legs and preparing to climb a broken bank, which would have given him a free run into the wood, when I presented my pistol at him and desired him to stand. He drew forth another, but did not level it at me. We were then about 15 yards from each other, the bank he fell from being between us. He stared at me with astonishment, and to tell you the truth, I was a little astonished at him, for he was covered with patches of kangaroo skins, and wore a black beard, a haversack, and powder horns slung across his shoulders. I wore my beard, also as I do now, and a curious pair we looked. After a moment's pause, he cried out, "Blackbeard against Greybeard for 1,000,000, and fired. I slapped at him, and I believe hit him, for he staggered but rallied again, and was clearing the bank between him and me, when Pugh arrived, and with the butt end of his firelock knocked him down, jumped after him, and battered his brains out, just as he was opening a clasp knife to defend himself. The ending of Howe was brutal. His broken head was removed from his body and exhibited on a spike in Hobart Town. The exhibition was supposed to be a warning and a deterrent to other would-be bushrangers. The man's corpse was buried in a shallow grave by the river. Many murders were attributed to him beside those referred to here, and it has been said that among his victims were 2 of his own cohorts who had committed some trivial wrongdoing. It was also claimed that Howe tied his hands and feet of one before shooting him. Howe's legacy. It is said that some of the most powerful men in Hobart and Launceston had special arrangements with Howe and his gang. The most substantial of these may have been the partnership that Howe had with the colony's wealthiest man, Edward Lord. It would seem that Lord was not squeaky clean, because much of the land he had added to his expanding holdings had come to him through government connections and favours. Lord was suspected of smuggling, monopolising trade in town, and keeping a shop against regulations. While perhaps Lord did not deal directly with Howe, but rather they had an understanding, Lord's wife Maria probably played a very important role in this arrangement, although Maria Lord, being an ex-convict, had contacts and the cultural understandings necessary to deal with the bushrangers. Maria also would run her husband's affairs in his absence. Lord died at 12 Westbourne Terrace, North London, on 14th of September 1859. At this time, his estate in England was valued at around £2,000, big bickies for the time, and he still held some property in Van Diemen's Land. His wife, who had remained in Van Diemen's Land, had died there 2 months before him. Lord and Maria were survived by one son and 2 daughters from their marriage. Lord was also survived by 3 sons and 1 daughter, born due to a relationship in England. If there was ever truly an official investigation into Howe's relationship with Edward Lord and Robert Knockwood, it really didn't go very far, as there is no documents from his testimony surviving. Carlo Canteri wrote in his book, Origins of Australian Social Banditry, a complete exposure of all the bushrangers' interconnecting linkages would shake Van Diemen's Land to its very rum cellars. The 25th of March 1820, the ex-convict come landowner Dennis Mccarty was drowned, and rumours of foul play followed. It wasn't long after Howe's death that a 40-page pamphlet, Michael Howe, the last and worst of the bushrangers of Van Diemen's Land, was released, written by Thomas E. Wells, a relative of Samuel Marston. It was printed by Andrew Bent in December 1818. It is the first work of general literature printed in Australia. In reality, the pamphlet was mostly just pure propaganda, an attempt to take the heat off the establishment by trying to explain that Howe had been so hard to catch, as he was such a barbarous, conniving, dangerous, and cunning outlaw. Relics of his life and death existed, although where they are now, I have no idea. Apparently, Dr. Robert Espy claimed that he dissected Howe's body and placed his thigh bone in the wall of his house at Sayscombe, Tasmania. In 1914, that bone was recovered. Dr. James Ross collected a large iron pot from the place where Howe died. Frank and Philip Pitt had a book returned to them that Howe had stolen, and the book cover was secured with kangaroo skin and sewn with sinew. The Campbelltown Museum once had on display a photograph of the original letter written by Michael Howe to Governor Thomas Davey in 1816 and signed by all the members of the gang. There is a gully on the Derwent River and a marsh near Oatlands that are named after Howe. Howe's story was the basis for the movie The Outlaw Michael Howe, which was made in Australia and released in 2013. Thank you for joining me on the journey into Michael Howe's life. Look forward to the next entry in the Convict Diaries. So come back and see me next time. Thank you. Bye.